Search for Nancy Guthrie. We do know 3 people were detained. Police activity could be seen 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home, and local police and several unmarked vehicles, including forensics and SWAT teams, could be seen gathering.
It was supposed to be a quiet Friday evening in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood outside Tucson, Arizona. Nancy Guthrie, an 84-year-old retired schoolteacher and the mother of NBC Today show co-anchor Savannah Guthrie, had spent the last hours of January 31st, 2026 at home, just an ordinary night in the house where she had built decades of memories. Neighbors would later describe her neighborhood as the kind of place where people wave from driveways and leave their porch lights on. Tucson's foothills are quiet like that, settled, safe. And yet by the early hours of February 1st, 2026, Nancy Guthrie had vanished from that same home, and what investigators found inside would send shockwaves through federal law enforcement and spark one of the most closely watched abduction investigations in recent American history. What makes this case so deeply unsettling is not the chaos that followed, it is the silence that preceded. There were no shattered windows, no overturned furniture, no screams reported by neighbors lying awake in the early hours. When the Pima County Sheriff's Department first arrived at Nancy's home and began their walkthrough, they were not confronted with a scene of violence in the traditional sense. What they were confronted with was something far more disturbing, evidence of a crime that had been carefully, methodically planned by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And the more investigators looked, the more they realized this was no ordinary missing persons case. According to the Pima County Sheriff's Department, Nancy Guthrie was last seen entering her home on the evening of January 31st. She was reported missing the following morning, February 1st, 2026, after failing to appear for a scheduled meeting with a friend. When that friend could not reach her and grew alarmed, law enforcement was contacted. Deputies arrived, and what they found on the front porch of her home, drops of blood confirmed by DNA analysis to belong to Nancy, told them everything they needed to know about what had happened in those dark hours before dawn. In a case already full of startling developments, perhaps none was more visceral than the footage released by FBI Director Kash Patel on February 10, 2026. That morning, Patel released 4 black and white still images on social media, captured by Nancy Guthrie's own doorbell camera. The images showed a masked intruder standing on Nancy's porch in the early morning hours of February 1st, the very morning she disappeared. The figure was wearing a ski mask, gloves, long pants, and a jacket. A handgun holster was visible, positioned in an unusual location on the suspect's body, described by investigators as being over his crotch area. Slung across the suspect's back was a 25-liter Ozark Trail hiker pack, a backpack sold exclusively at Walmart. What the footage revealed next was deeply calculated. The masked individual attempted to tamper with Nancy's video doorbell, first tapping at it lightly in an attempt to knock it loose, and when that failed, reaching over and covering the camera lens with foliage from a potted plant nearby. This was not the behavior of someone acting impulsively. This was someone who had done their research, who understood how doorbell cameras work, and who came prepared to neutralize them. The chilling irony, of course, is that despite the suspect's best efforts, investigators were still able to recover data from the device. The camera had already captured enough. Later that same day, the FBI released 2 video clips from the doorbell footage as well. Based on this footage, investigators were subsequently able to piece together a physical description of the suspect, a male between 5 feet 9 and 5 feet 10 inches tall, with an average build, and what appeared to be a dark mustache visible beneath the mask. It was a precise description. And yet, weeks later, that masked figure would remain unidentified, his face hidden, his name unknown, his motive only speculated about. What was not in doubt was this: he had been on Nancy Guthrie's porch, armed and gloved, in the hours before her disappearance. The blood on the porch confirmed she had been taken against her will. When federal agents entered Nancy Guthrie's home and began conducting their forensic sweep, they were methodical in a way that career investigators describe as hunting for the story a space tells when the people inside it can no longer speak for themselves. Every room was documented. Every surface was examined. Law enforcement sources confirmed that DNA evidence was recovered both inside the home and outside on the porch. The blood on the front porch was identified as Nancy's. But inside the home, investigators also encountered something that deepened the complexity of the case: mixed DNA that did not belong to Nancy herself, nor to those in close regular contact with her. That DNA, which Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed authorities were still working to process, would become one of the most tantalizing unresolved threads in the entire investigation. But the physical evidence inside the home told only part of the story. What investigators also found, and what would prove just as significant, was what was missing. Nancy Guthrie relied on daily vital medication to manage her health. That medication had not been taken with her. When law enforcement and medical advisors assessed the situation in the first hours of the investigation, they immediately raised alarm about her well-being. An 84-year-old woman removed from her home by force, deprived of her necessary medications, with no way to obtain them independently, the implications were grave, and authorities communicated that gravity clearly from the earliest press briefings. There was also the matter of the internet and power infrastructure near her home. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed in mid-February that investigators were looking into what appeared to be a power or internet outage around the time of Nancy's abduction on the morning of February 1st. A utility box around the corner from her home was found showing signs of tampering, though Nanos was careful to note that investigators had not conclusively connected that tampered box to the specific outage. Whether or not those two elements were directly linked, the pattern they suggested was troubling. Someone had potentially moved to disrupt digital surveillance infrastructure in the neighborhood before taking Nancy from her home. This was not the work of an opportunist. This bore the hallmarks of deliberate, advanced preparation. One of the most significant pieces of physical evidence recovered in the days following Nancy's disappearance was a single black glove found approximately 2 miles from her home. The glove appeared to match the type worn by the suspect seen on the doorbell camera footage, and DNA testing confirmed it carried the genetic profile of an unknown male. In the immediate aftermath of that discovery, investigators felt they had something concrete, something that could crack the case open. The DNA profile was submitted to CODIS, the FBI's National Combined Genetic Database, used by law enforcement across the country to match crime scene DNA to known offenders. The result came back empty. No match. The unknown male's DNA profile was not in the national database, meaning whoever left that DNA had either never been arrested or convicted of a qualifying offense, or had simply never entered the system. It was a deflating moment in an investigation that had been building toward a breakthrough. But investigators did not stop there. The FBI announced that investigative genetic genealogy, a forensic method that uses crime scene DNA to trace potential relatives through public genealogy databases when traditional databases like CODIS yield nothing, was already underway. This technique, which gained widespread attention after it helped solve the Golden State Killer case, represents one of the most powerful new tools available to modern investigators. Then came another development that shifted the narrative once again. In a statement that surprised many observers, the Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed that the DNA from the black gloves had actually been traced, not to the suspect, but to a local restaurant employee who was subsequently cleared of any involvement in Nancy's disappearance. Authorities did not disclose exactly how investigators connected the gloves to the employee, but the department confirmed the individual was not part of this investigation. Meanwhile, investigators had also searched a total of 16 pairs of gloves recovered in the area surrounding Nancy's home, most of which were later traced back to members of the volunteer search teams who had combed the neighborhood in the days after her disappearance. Every thread, it seemed, led somewhere, just not to the answer everyone was hoping for. In late February and into early March, a significant development unfolded at Nancy Guthrie's Catalina Foothills home. Up to a dozen investigators in unmarked vehicles were observed descending on the property for several hours, conducting what law enforcement sources described to reporters as a final comprehensive sweep of the residence. The agents spent considerable time near the front door, focusing on the porch and the walkway where Nancy's blood had been discovered on the morning she disappeared. At one point, a vehicle with tinted windows pulled directly into the garage, an unusual move observed by reporters monitoring the scene from outside the property. The investigators were also seen inside the home's foyer, appearing to peer outward toward the porch, the same vantage point from which Nancy's security camera had recorded the masked intruder. Sources indicated the agents were examining sight lines, distances, camera angles, and the physical relationship between where the suspect stood and where the camera's lens was positioned. After the hours-long operation concluded, law enforcement announced they were preparing to release the property back to Nancy's family, her children, including Savannah Guthrie. This final sweep was not a desperate scramble. It was a careful, methodical closing of the evidentiary chapter at the residence, conducted before the family took back possession of the home that had been held as part of an active crime scene. The return of the property to the family marked a shift in the operational geography of the investigation. No longer would Nancy's home be the central hub of daily forensic activity. The investigation would continue, but its focus had moved outward beyond those four walls into the network of digital evidence, financial trails, genetic analysis, and witness tips that law enforcement was pursuing through other channels. The home had given investigators everything it was going to give. Now the case lived in data servers, in genealogy databases, in the memories of people who might know something and had not yet come forward. Almost immediately after Nancy's disappearance became public, a wave of ransom communications began surfacing, and they complicated the investigation in ways that investigators were reluctant to discuss openly. On February 2, 2026, KOLD-TV, a CBS affiliate in Tucson, reported that it had received a letter demanding payment for Nancy Guthrie's release. Investigators reviewed the letter, took its content seriously, and shared it with the FBI. Authorities declined to confirm whether the letter was genuine, but notably, the note was said to contain specific details about Nancy's home and about what she had been wearing on the night she disappeared. Details that were not publicly known, details that would have required direct knowledge of the scene. The following day, TMZ reported receiving its own alleged ransom note, this one demanding millions of dollars in Bitcoin, including a specific cryptocurrency wallet address and a deadline. On February 5th, TMZ founder Harvey Levin said he had received yet another note that read, in part, "You will have no way of contacting me." 2 deadlines came and went with no public resolution. Savannah Guthrie and her siblings released a video on February 7th that appeared directed at whoever was holding their mother, with Savannah saying directly, "We receive your message and we understand. We beg you now to return our mother to us so that we can celebrate with her. This is the only way we will have peace. This is very valuable to us, and we will pay." Those words, "we will pay," were not improvised. They were, by all accounts, part of a deliberate strategy coordinated with law enforcement. Former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffindaffer, speaking to Newsweek, analyzed the family's public statements and the sheriff's comments and offered her interpretation. From the very beginning, investigators believed this was a kidnapping for ransom. The family's televised appearances, the social media posts, the carefully worded pleas, all of it, Coffindaffer argued, was orchestrated to maintain communication with whoever had taken Nancy, to keep a channel open, to demonstrate willingness to engage. That's why they had the family go on television, making social media posts, making this plea. That's why they orchestrated all of that, Coffindaffer told Newsweek. As of March 2026, no arrest had been made, and no confirmed proof of life had been received by the family. As weeks passed and investigation widened, law enforcement pursued multiple threads simultaneously, some of which briefly appeared to be the breakthrough the case needed, only to fall short. During the evening of February 10th, just hours after the FBI released its surveillance images of the masked suspect, a person of interest was detained following a traffic stop in Rio Rico, Arizona, roughly 60 miles south of Tucson. On February 13th, the Sheriff's Department launched a separate operation at a residence located 2 miles from Nancy's home. 2 individuals were removed from the property, and the surrounding roads were closed to the public for approximately 4 hours. One of those individuals was taken in for questioning and was released by the following day. At roughly the same time, investigators were photographed examining a gray Range Rover in the parking lot of a nearby Culver's restaurant. None of these operations, each one significant enough to generate media coverage and public speculation, produced a named suspect or led to charges. But each one narrowed the field, confirmed or eliminated possibilities, and contributed to the investigative picture being assembled behind closed doors. A separate theory also emerged in early March when a retired FBI agent raised the question of whether investigators should be looking closely at a home invasion that had occurred in Scottsdale, Arizona, on the very same morning, January 31st, just hours before Nancy Guthrie disappeared. In that incident, 2 teenage suspects from California, aged 16 and 17, had allegedly posed as delivery drivers to gain entry to home, then duct-taped and assaulted the residents in what investigators described as an attempted cryptocurrency theft. The suspects were arrested after a brief police pursuit and subsequently pleaded not guilty to multiple felony charges. The timing was striking. The Scottsdale incident occurred hours before Nancy was taken, and the cryptocurrency connection, given the Bitcoin ransom notes in the Guthrie case, was a detail that investigators were at minimum aware of. On February 24, 2026, Savannah Guthrie announced her family was offering a $1 million private reward for information leading to Nancy's recovery. The FBI's existing reward of $100,000 was already in place, bringing the combined total to over $1.2 million, one of the largest reward packages in a recent American abduction case. The impact of the announcement was immediate. The FBI reported that approximately 1,500 new tips had poured in within days of the reward announcement. With tens of thousands of tips accumulated across the investigation, the challenge for investigators shifted from generating leads to sorting, verifying, and prioritizing them, an enormous undertaking that required dedicated resources. Sheriff Nanos, who has led the local component of the investigation from its first hours, confirmed to reporters that 400 investigators had been working on thousands of tips and leads in the weeks following Nancy's disappearance. He spoke publicly about his belief that the investigation was progressing, that authorities were definitely closer to identifying a suspect. He also made a direct public appeal to whoever had taken Nancy, telling them in front of cameras, "Just let her go. It will work out better for you in the long run. Take her to a park. Take her to the hospital. Just let her go." These were not the words of a sheriff who believed the trail had gone cold. These were the words of someone who believed communication, or at least the possibility of it, remained open. At the same time, Nanos and the investigation drew criticism. The nonprofit organization United Cajun Navy, a volunteer-led search group, publicly stated that it had offered a full operational search package to the sheriff and received no response. Some observers interpreted the rejection of civilian search help as a sign that investigators believed a ground search was either redundant or potentially compromising, perhaps even, as former FBI agent Coffindaffer suggested to Newsweek, a sign that they were close to an arrest and did not want outside activity contaminating the operational picture. Others simply viewed it as a breakdown in communication. Sheriff Nanos also faced the additional complication of a separate $1 million lawsuit filed by an Arizona inmate alleging misconduct, a distraction that his department publicly set aside in order to focus on the Guthrie investigation. By mid-March 2026, more than 40 days had passed since Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her Catalina Foothills home. Her adult children, Annie and Cameron, were photographed making a brief visit to the family's property on March 10th, a quiet, private moment observed by reporters who had maintained a presence near the scene. Savannah Guthrie, who had spent weeks in Arizona assisting with the search effort, returned to New York City and her role at the Today Show, a decision that in no way reflected a reduction in the family's commitment to finding their mother, but which reflected the impossible weight of maintaining ordinary life while enduring the unthinkable. In a recent television appearance, she acknowledged her family's deep uncertainty and their unbroken hope. The investigation itself had by this point migrated from the visible, dramatic phase of door-to-door searches and surveillance footage releases into something quieter and, in many ways, more methodical. Investigative genetic genealogy was underway on the DNA evidence. Mixed DNA recovered inside the home was still being processed. Digital forensics teams were analyzing devices, network logs, and the digital records left behind by every piece of technology, from the tampered doorbell camera to the router logs that documented which devices had been active on Nancy's home network in the hours before she vanished. Law enforcement was also reviewing surveillance footage of vehicles traveling through the Catalina Foothills area, having asked homeowners to submit any footage from Ring cameras and other private security systems in the surrounding community. Sheriff Nanos stated publicly that investigators believe the crime was targeted, that whoever took Nancy Guthrie chose her specifically and came to her home with a plan. "We believe we know why he did this, and we believe that it was targeted," Nanos told NBC Nightly News. He also said something that sent a chill through Tucson and beyond. "Don't think for a minute that because it happened to the Guthrie family, you're safe. Keep your wits about you." Those words were not rhetorical. They were a warning, and they carried within them the implication that investigators, despite their progress, had not yet contained the threat. The suspect was still out there. And whoever he was, he had proven himself capable of planning, executing, and disappearing without a trace. The case of Nancy Guthrie is many things simultaneously. It is a family's nightmare, played out in public under the glare of national media attention. It is a law enforcement,